Welcome on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Thank you for tuning into our discussion today about the current political situation in Libya and an outlook on its civil war. Joining me today is Stephen Cook, who is a Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies and Director of the International Affairs Fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the author of several books, one of which, The Struggle for Egypt, won the gold medal from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Stephen is also a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine and has published widely in international affairs journals. Thank you, Stephen, for your time today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. I'm sorry I can't be with you in Houston.
Us too. To begin our conversation, could you provide an overview of Libya's political structure and also the conflict between Tripoli-based GNA, which is the interim government of Libya, and military commander Khalifa Haftar's Libyan National Army?
Well, one of the big problems in Libya since the uprising against Muammar Gaddafi, which began in February 2011, is that it doesn't really have much of a political structure. I think optimists here in Washington believe that once Gaddafi fell and ultimately left the scene, that Libya would be sort of a blank slate upon which to build a Middle Eastern democracy. That actually did not obviously take place. And what you have is you did have elections, you did have an interim government form, but of course, through years of political problems, you essentially had a split. And two governments formed. You have a government in Tripoli and you have a government of the East based in Tobruk. And it is been a struggle and actually a civil war between the two. Now, the government in Tripoli, the current interim government, is recognized by the United Nations and many other governments around the world. And the other government, the government of the East, which has a parliament and this leader, Khalifa Haftar, who is the leader of what he's calling the Libyan National Army. He's a dual Libyan-American citizen. He was a general in the service of Muammar Gaddafi. He was captured during Gaddafi's campaign in Chad in the 1980s, and then subsequently turned on Gaddafi. He returned to Libya from Northern Virginia after Gaddafi fell and is now making a bid for power. Where we are right now is that almost exactly a year ago, Haftar and his allies undertook an all-out assault to wrest the country, specifically the capital Tripoli, from the internationally recognized government.
Mm-hmm. And what does the struggle currently look like? I know recently Tripoli took back control of 3 coastal cities from Haftar's forces. Is this a turning point in any way?
Well, certainly in the initial battle in this offensive, few believed that the internationally recognized government in Tripoli would be able to hold out under the assault of Haftar's forces, which enjoyed the support of Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. The government in Tripoli has enjoyed military support from others, including Turkey and Qatar. And the Turks are very important in this, and we'll come back to that. And he did gain some momentum relatively recently. That's Haftar gained momentum relatively recently with the introduction of Russian mercenaries in response to this. And he actually had taken over a number of cities that had been held by the interim government and was closing in on Libya with the help of these Russian mercenaries, weaponry from the United Arab Emirates, support from Egypt. And then Turkey deployed large numbers of their own mercenaries, essentially Syrian militias that they supported in Syria, as well as a fair amount of Turkish weaponry, notably armed drones. This seems to have turned the tide against Haftar, and there has been essentially a stalemate between the two sides. But as you correctly point out, the government of national accord, the interim government, has regained some territory, although parts of Tripoli still remain vulnerable to Haftar's forces with shelling, the cutting off of electricity and water. So it's a terrible, terrible mess. And add to it, of course, the global pandemic associated with the coronavirus. And Libyans find themselves in a fairly dire situation.
Right. And you just touched on this, but to expand a little bit, what the international intervention has been like, and maybe especially looking at the North Africa, Middle East region and from the United States.
Well, the United States has expressed its support for the internationally recognized government, but it has actually supported General Haftar. President of the United States took a phone call from Haftar last April, meaning April 2019, which seemed to signal at least the White House's support for Haftar. Now, of course, the official position of the United States remains support for the internationally recognized government. More broadly, this conflict has turned into a proxy war, specifically between Turkey, which supports Tripoli, and the Egyptians and the Emiratis who support General Haftar. This is just part of a broader regional struggle playing out among those powers. And there have been others, obviously, who've drawn in. The French, for example, support General Haftar, whereas the Italians and others support the government in Tripoli. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey recently traveled to North Africa to elicit the support of both the Algerians and the Tunisians for Turkey's efforts in Libya. And he specifically asked the Tunisians to host on their territory Turkish Air Force planes, and the Tunisians rebuffed him. So there are obviously the Tunisians and the Algerians much, much closer to this conflict are quite worried about spillover into their borders. North Africa, as you well know, is a locus for extremist activity, and obviously, and Libya has lots of extremists and lots of weaponry.
Right. Thank you, Stephen. And, of course, with the civil war, there has risen a significant humanitarian crisis as well. So what is happening to the migrants and asylum seekers from Libya?
Well, first of all, there are migrants and asylum seekers who are not from Libya who have been trying to get to Europe. There have been gruesome reports of Africans who are basically being held in camps in perpetuity under horrible conditions in Libya. And then, of course, there was a phenomenon that was quite important for the international community, particularly Europe, in 2015 and 2016. And these are these migrant boats that were trying to cross the Mediterranean to get into European countries, and contributed to the rise of hard-right nationalist and even neo-Nazi parties in Europe recently. But I think the real concern now is, and the major concern on the part of international aid organizations, the United Nations, is the fragility or non-existence of medical care in Libya as the coronavirus pandemic takes hold in that country. As of the time that we are talking, Johns Hopkins University's coronavirus map indicated that Libya had just 26 cases of COVID-19, the disease associated with coronavirus, but it's hard to believe that this will not spread and take hold, especially with relatively large numbers of Turks in the country, large numbers of Syrians coming into the country, Russians as well, all of which are themselves struggling with the coronavirus pandemic, as is everybody in the world. So, but Libya, a country that has basically been mostly in chaos since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, already with a fragile public health system, and then a public health system that's been targeted by different groups in this conflict, suggests that as the virus takes hold, there will be a significant toll on the Libyan people.
No, it's an unfortunate situation.
To say the least.
Lastly, what events do you think will lead to an end to this conflict?
Well, like all conflicts of this nature, I think either the victory of one side over the other, the proxies, the external proxies, settle their differences in other arenas, and then Libya becomes less important to them, and then subsequently the actors, the main Libyan actors, grow tired of the conflict. The problem is that conflicts such as these tend to last between 7 and 15 years. And before Gaddafi fell, his son, Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi, warned Libyans that if the country fell into violence, they would fight for 40 years, that it would take, that was their nature, and they would fight for 40 years. Given the fact that the Secretary General of the United Nations has called for a ceasefire in Libya, and all the factions there have essentially ignored it, and the fighting continues, and in fact has intensified in recent days, would suggest that perhaps, unfortunately, Gaddafi's son was correct, and we're in for a long period of violence in Libya.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, to listen to other conversations on several different topics. And stay safe.
Thanks so much, everyone. We good?